The wagon lurched to a halt in front of the dusty mercantile, and Josephine Thompson pressed her hand against her chest, certain her heart would burst through her bodice at the sight stretching endlessly before her. Mountains. Real mountains. Not the gentle hills of Ohio she had left behind 3 months ago, but jagged peaks that scraped the belly of the sky itself, their snow-capped summits gleaming like crown jewels in the afternoon sun of Colorado territory. "End of the line, miss," the wagon driver called down, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been sympathy. "Welcome to Boulder, 1872. Not much to look at compared to civilization, but it's got what most folks need." Josephine gathered her skirts and accepted his calloused hand to climb down, her legs trembling from more than just the 3-day journey from Denver. Everything she owned sat in 2 modest trunks behind her, and the letter of employment from the Boulder Mining Company crinkled in her pocket, promising work as a bookkeeper and clerk. At 22 years old, she had never imagined leaving Ohio, never dreamed she would venture beyond the comfortable predictability of her father's general store. But consumption had taken both her parents within 6 months of each other, leaving her with nothing but debts and memories. The driver unloaded her trunks with unceremonious thuds onto the wooden boardwalk. "Mining office is 3 buildings down. Good luck to you, miss." Before she could thank him properly, the wagon was already rolling away, leaving her standing alone among strangers who paid her no mind. Boulder stretched along a wide street flanked by wooden buildings, some painted, most weathered gray by the harsh mountain climate. Men in dusty work clothes moved with purpose between establishments, and the distant sound of hammers striking metal rang through the thin mountain air. She had never felt so small. Drawing a deep breath that seemed insufficient in the altitude, Josephine straightened her spine and picked up the smaller of her 2 trunks. A gentleman would have helped, but this was the frontier, and she suspected gentlemen were in short supply. She managed 3 steps before the trunk's weight and her already exhausted arms betrayed her. The trunk dropped, spilling her carefully folded dresses across the dusty boardwalk. "Damn it all," she whispered, then immediately glanced around, mortified by her own language. But no one seemed to notice or care. She knelt to gather her belongings, fighting back tears that would help nothing. "That trunk's too heavy for you." The voice came from above and behind her, deep as thunder rolling through a valley. Josephine twisted to look up and up further still, her breath catching for an entirely different reason than the altitude. The man towering over her seemed carved from the very mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they blocked the sun, casting her in his shadow. Dark hair fell past his collar, streaked with lighter strands from hours in the high country sun. His face was all hard planes and angles, weathered bronze from wind and weather, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. But his eyes held her attention, pale blue as a mountain lake, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He wore buckskin pants and a heavy wool shirt rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. A large knife hung at his belt alongside various other tools and pouches she could not identify. Everything about him spoke of strength, competence, and raw masculine power. "I can manage," Josephine said, though they both knew it was a lie. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Sure you can, but you will be managing it when snow falls tomorrow, at the pace you are setting." He bent and gathered her scattered clothes with surprising gentleness for hands so large and scarred, placing them back in the trunk. Then he lifted it as though it weighed nothing at all. "Where are you headed?" "The mining office. I have employment there as a bookkeeper." His pale eyes swept over her again, and she resisted the urge to check if her hair had come completely loose from its pins. "You are a long way from wherever you came from. Ohio. And yes, I am aware." This time he did smile, transforming his stern features into something unexpectedly warm. "I am Tobias Dalton. Most folks just call me Dalton. I trap and guide in the mountains, bring furs and meat to town when supplies run low." "And you are?" "Josephine Thompson. Most folks just call me Josephine." His smile deepened at her gentle mockery. "Fair enough. Come on then, Josephine from Ohio. Let me get you to the mining office before you collapse. You look like you have been traveling hard." She wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of independence, but her exhausted body overruled her pride. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Just Dalton." He collected her second trunk as well, carrying both as though they were empty, and started down the boardwalk. Josephine hurried to keep pace with his long strides, very aware of the curious glances they drew from other townspeople. A proper lady would have refused help from a stranger, especially one who looked like he belonged more to the wilderness than civilization. But she was discovering that propriety mattered less when faced with the practical realities of survival in this harsh new world. The mining office occupied a sturdy building near the end of the main street. Dalton set her trunks down carefully and pulled open the door, gesturing for her to enter. Inside, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a cluttered desk, surprise crossing his features. "Help you?" he asked, addressing Dalton rather than Josephine. "She is here for employment," Dalton said, his tone suggesting the man should have known better than to ignore her. "Ah, yes, Miss Thompson." The man rose, extending his hand. "I'm Harold Fletcher, office manager. We received your letters of reference from Ohio. Quite impressive recommendations." "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity." Fletcher launched into explanations about her duties, the books she would keep, the correspondence she would manage. Josephine forced herself to focus despite her exhaustion, asking questions when appropriate, taking mental notes. The work itself sounded straightforward enough, though the volume would be substantial. The salary was modest but sufficient, and Fletcher mentioned boarding arrangements at a respectable house run by a widow named Mrs. Morrison. Through it all, she remained acutely aware of Dalton standing quietly near the door, making no move to leave. His presence filled the room like a storm about to break, impossible to ignore. "When would you like me to begin?" Josephine asked. "Monday would be ideal, giving you a few days to settle in. Mrs. Morrison's boarding house is just up the street, the white house with blue shutters." "Tell her I sent you." Fletcher pulled out his pocket watch, frowning. "I would walk you there myself, but I'm expecting a delivery any moment." "I know where it is," Dalton said. "I will see her there safely." Fletcher looked relieved. "Excellent. Thank you, Dalton. Miss Thompson, we'll see you Monday morning, 8 o'clock sharp." Outside, Josephine turned to face the mountain man, determined to establish some boundaries before this went any further. "Mr. Dalton, I appreciate your help truly, but I can find my own way from here." "You must have your own business to attend to." "I do, but that business can wait another 10 minutes. He picked up her trunks again. "This is not Ohio, Josephine. Things work differently here. You help when help is needed, especially when a woman arrives alone in a mining town with nothing but hope and 2 trunks to her name. It is not charity, it is survival. Tomorrow, maybe you help someone else." Put that way, her pride seemed not just foolish but dangerous. She nodded, throat tight. "Then thank you. Again." Mrs. Morrison's boarding house proved clean, warm, and welcoming. The widow herself was a formidable woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a kind smile. She sized up Josephine in seconds and approved. quoting reasonable rates and showing her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. Dalton carried her trunks up the narrow stairs without being asked, setting them down gently despite the ease with which he handled their weight. "You will do fine here," he said, standing in the doorway of her new room. "Mrs. Morrison runs a respectable house, and Fletcher is fair if demanding. The work will be hard, especially at this altitude until you adjust. Drink plenty of water, rest when you can, and do not be too proud to ask for help. Advice from experience. Advice from watching people who did not listen and suffered for it." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture surprisingly courteous from someone so rough around the edges. "Welcome to Colorado territory, Josephine Thompson." He was gone before she could find words adequate to express her gratitude, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, the front door closing with a solid thud that seemed to echo through her chest. "Mrs. Morrison appeared moments later with fresh linens and a knowing smile. "Dalton is a good man, though he frightens some folks with that quiet intensity of his. Lives up in the mountains most of the year, only comes to town when necessary. Been doing that for near about 8 years now, since he arrived from Montana after some trouble up there. Never says what kind of trouble, and folks know better than to ask." Josephine should not have been interested. She had come here to work, to build a new life on her own terms, not to entangle herself with mysterious mountain men no matter how helpful or handsome. But as she unpacked her belongings and arranged them in her small room, she found herself returning again and again to the memory of pale blue eyes and a voice like distant thunder. The next 3 days passed in a blur of adjustment. True to Dalton's prediction, snow did fall that first evening, a light dusting that melted by mid-morning but left her shivering and grateful for the boarding house's solid construction. She explored Boulder's limited offerings, purchased additional supplies for the cold weather ahead, and tried not to feel overwhelmed by how different everything was from Ohio's gentle landscapes. The mountains dominated everything, impossible to ignore, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. They changed with the light, purple shadows at dawn, golden fire at sunset, stern gray under clouds. She found herself staring at them for long moments, trying to comprehend their scale, their wildness, the way they seemed to stretch into infinity. On her third evening, restless and unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Josephine bundled into her warmest shawl and ventured onto Mrs. Morrison's front porch. The air bit cold and sharp, scented with pine and wood smoke. Stars blazed overhead in impossible numbers, undimmed by city lights because there were no city lights to dim them. "Cannot sleep," she spun, heart leaping, to find Dalton sitting on the porch steps where shadows had concealed him. He held a tin cup that steamed in the cold air, and his coat lay open despite temperatures that had her huddling into her shawl. "I did not see you there," she managed, one hand pressed to her racing heart. "I know. You should have. That is something you need to learn out here, seeing what is really around you instead of just what you expect." He patted the step beside him. "Sit. I do not bite, and Mrs. Morrison would take a broom to me if I tried anything improper with one of her boarders." Josephine hesitated, then gathered her skirts and sat, maintaining a respectable distance between them. Up close, she could smell leather and pine on him, scents that seemed as natural as breathing. "What are you doing here?" brought Mrs. Morrison a haunch of venison. "She makes good stew, and I had extra from my hunt. Figured I would finish my coffee before heading back." He held out the cup. "Want some? It is strong enough to float a horseshoe, but it will warm you." The coffee was indeed viciously strong, but the heat felt glorious sliding down her throat. She took a second sip before handing it back. "Thank you, and thank you again for your help when I arrived. I never properly thanked you." You thank me plenty. How are you settling in? Well enough, I think. Everything is so different here. The air, the light, the mountains. She gestured helplessly at the vast darkness beyond town. They are always there, no matter where you look. It feels like they are watching. They are, in a way. Mountains demand respect. They will kill you without malice if you are careless or stupid. He took a long drink of coffee, his profile sharp against the star-scattered sky. But they are also the most beautiful thing in creation when you learn to really see them. Every trail tells a story. Every valley holds secrets. A man could spend his whole life exploring and never see it all. Something in his voice made her turn to study him more carefully. You love them? Yes. Simple, certain, no hesitation. I was not born to mountains, but I was born for them, if that makes sense. The moment I came west and saw them for the first time, something in me just knew I was home. Been up there ever since, except when supplies or winter storms drive me down. Do you not get lonely? His smile was faint, almost sad. Sometimes, but there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. The mountains are never really silent. There is always something, some sound or sight or feeling. It suits me better than towns ever could. He glanced at her. Though I suppose that sounds strange to someone who chose to come work in an office. Not so strange. I think I understand a little. I did not come here because I wanted an office. I came here because I had nowhere else to go and nothing to lose. The admission surprised her, but something about the darkness and his quiet presence loosened her usual reserve. My parents died last winter. Their debts consumed everything. I could have stayed and worked for someone else in their store, but it felt like living in a ghost house. When I saw the advertisement for a bookkeeper position in Colorado Territory, it seemed like a sign. A chance to start fresh somewhere none of the old ghosts could follow. Did it work? I do not know yet. Ask me in a few months. They sat in companionable silence while he finished his coffee. The cold had stopped biting so fiercely, though whether from the coffee or the company she could not say. You start at the mining office Monday? Dalton asked eventually. Yes. 8 o'clock sharp. Fletcher will work you hard but treat you fair. The miners can be rough, but they need what you provide, so they will mostly behave themselves. Any of them give you trouble, you tell Fletcher. He has ways of handling it. He stood, unfolding to his full impressive height. I am heading back up to my cabin tomorrow, probably be gone a few weeks. But when I come back down, if you want, I could show you some of the easier trails. Help you get a sense of the country around here. Her first instinct was to refuse. She barely knew this man, and wandering into the wilderness with him seemed the height of foolishness. But something in his steady gaze promised safety rather than danger, and she found herself nodding. I would like that. Good. He touched his hat brim in that same courteous gesture. Stay warm, Josephine Thompson. And good luck Monday. She watched him walk down the street and disappear into the darkness beyond the last buildings, swallowed by the wilderness that was his true home. Then she went inside, climbed the stairs to her cold room, and slept better than she had since leaving Ohio. Monday morning arrived gray and cold with the promise of more snow. Josephine dressed in her most professional attire, pinned her hair severely, and presented herself at the mining office precisely at 8. Fletcher seemed pleased by her punctuality and immediately set her to work on books that had been neglected for weeks. The work itself proved challenging but satisfying. Numbers had always made sense to her in ways people often did not. Neat columns and balanced ledgers offering certainty in an uncertain world. The mining office dealt with payrolls, supply orders, ore shipments, and countless other financial details that required careful tracking. Fletcher had let things slide during his previous bookkeeper's prolonged illness and eventual death, and Josephine threw herself into bringing order to chaos. Days blended into weeks. November gave way to December, and snow became a constant presence. She learned to navigate Boulder's routines, became familiar with the regular customers and workers who cycled through the office. Some miners tried testing her with crude jokes or lingering glances, but a sharp word and Fletcher's quick intervention established boundaries that most respected. She had been in Boulder nearly a month when Dalton returned. Josephine was closing up the office on a frigid Tuesday evening when movement caught her eye. She looked up to find the mountain man approaching, leading a heavily laden pack horse. Her heart performed an embarrassing little leap that she firmly ignored. "You survived," he said by way of greeting, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Did you doubt I would?" "No, but surviving and thriving are different things. You look like you are doing both." She could not help smiling. "The work is good, challenging but manageable. And I have stopped gasping like a fish every time I climb stairs, so I must be adjusting to the altitude." His answering smile transformed his stern features. "That is good, real good. You still interested in seeing some of the country? Now, it is nearly dark and snow is coming." "Not now. Sunday, if the weather holds. There is a trail that leads up to an overlook, maybe an hour's walk. Good views, not too difficult, perfect for a beginner. I could show you if you want." She should refuse. She had work to catch up on, mending to-do letters to write. But when she opened her mouth, different words emerged. "Sunday. What time?" "I will meet you at Mrs. Morrison's at 10. Dress warm, wear your sturdiest boots." His eyes swept over her thin coat and impractical town shoes with obvious doubt. "You do have sturdy boots." "I will by Sunday," she promised, even though she had no such thing and no idea where to acquire them. Mrs. Morrison, it turned out, had opinions about Josephine's planned excursion, and those opinions came with her late husband's spare boots and a warmer coat that had belonged to her son before he moved to California. Dalton is a good man, but he forgets sometimes that not everyone is built for the wilderness like he is. You take these, and you take this canteen too. Stay close to him, listen to what he says, and do not try to prove anything foolish. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the kind of brilliant winter day that made everything sparkle. Josephine dressed in layers as Mrs. Morrison had advised, laced up the borrowed boots that were only slightly too large, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with altitude. Dalton arrived precisely at 10, looking amused by her bundled appearance. "You look ready," Mrs. Morrison insisted. Mrs. Morrison is a wise woman. "Come on, we are burning daylight." They walked through town and beyond, following a path that quickly left buildings behind. The trail climbed steadily through pine forest, snow crunching under their boots, their breath clouding white. Josephine struggled to match Dalton's easy pace, her legs burning, her lungs working hard. He noticed, of course, and slowed without comment, pointing out landmarks and features as they climbed. "See that rock formation? Miners call it the Eagle because of how it looks from below. And that valley there, that is Boulder Creek Valley. Come spring, wildflowers cover every inch like a carpet." They emerged from the trees onto an open ridge, and Josephine forgot her burning legs and aching lungs. The view stole her breath more effectively than the altitude ever could. Mountains stretched in every direction, wave after wave of peaks marching toward horizons she could not see. Snow covered their upper reaches, and the morning sun turned everything golden and rose. Boulder sat far below, small and insignificant against the vastness. "Oh," she whispered, inadequate and heartfelt. Dalton stood beside her, hands resting easy on his hips, a small, satisfied smile playing at his mouth. "Worth the climb. I have never seen anything like it, never imagined anything like it. This is just the beginning. There are hundreds of trails up here, thousands of views. Every season changes everything, makes it new again." He gestured broadly at the surrounding peaks. "All of this, as far as you can see and further, it is yours if you want it. All you have to do is be willing to walk the trails and see what is there." Something in his words, in the way he offered her the mountains like a gift only he could give, made her throat tight. "Show me," she said. "Show me all of it. Every trail, every view, I want to see what you see." His pale blue eyes met hers, intense and searching. "That could take a lifetime." "Then we better start now." They stayed on the ridge for nearly an hour while he pointed out peaks and valleys, naming them when they had names, describing what lay beyond when they did not. His love for this country bled through every word, and Josephine found herself falling in love not just with the mountains but with the way he spoke of them. The reverence and joy intertwined. The walk back down proved easier on her lungs but harder on her legs, different muscles protesting the descent. Dalton steadied her more than once when her borrowed boots slipped on snow-covered rocks, his hand warm and strong around her arm. By the time they reached town again, exhaustion dragged at her, but satisfaction ran deeper. "Thank you," she said outside Mrs. Morrison's boarding house. "That was incredible. First of many, if you meant what you said up there." "I meant it." "Good." He hesitated, something uncertain crossing his features, vulnerability unexpected on such a strong face. "I am not much for towns or society, Josephine. I know how to survive in the wilderness, how to track and hunt and find my way through country that would kill most men. But the other stuff, the talking and courting and figuring out what a woman wants, that is harder for me than any mountain trail. So I am just going to say this plain. I like you. I would like to spend more time with you. If that interests you, I will be here every Sunday I am in town. If it does not, I will understand and I will leave you be." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had known, of course, on some level had recognized his interest and her own. But having it stated so clearly, so honestly, required an equally honest response. "I like you too," she said, the words feeling momentous and terrifying. "And yes, I would very much like to spend more time with you." His smile broke like sunrise over mountains. "Sunday then, and every Sunday after, for as long as you will have me." That became their pattern through the winter. Sundays, when weather permitted, Dalton would arrive at Mrs. Morrison's and they would venture into the wilderness. He showed her trail after trail, each one revealing new wonders. Some days they climbed to high overlooks. Other days they followed creek beds through narrow valleys. He taught her to read the mountains, to recognize the signs of changing weather, to move quietly through the forest and see what lived there. Between Sundays, she worked her long hours at the mining office and thought about him far too often. He began stopping by when he came to town for supplies, brief visits that brightened her days. They talked about everything and nothing, finding unexpected common ground between her love of numbers and order and his intimate knowledge of natural patterns and cycles. Christmas came and went, celebrated quietly at Mrs. Morrison's with other boarders. Dalton brought Josephine a gift that made her eyes sting. A pair of proper mountain boots, sized perfectly for her feet. She gave him a new knife with a handle she had commissioned from the local blacksmith, carved with mountain peaks. The way his face lit up when he saw it told her she had chosen well. Winter deepened, bringing storms that kept them in town for weeks at a time. On those Sundays, they walked Boulder's limited streets or sat in Mrs. Morrison's parlor, properly chaperoned, talking for hours. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, his restless youth, the way he had drifted west seeking something he could not name until he found it in the mountains. He learned about her quiet life in Ohio, her parents' long illness, her determination to build something new from the ruins of her old life. "You are brave," he said one snow-locked Sunday, firelight playing across his features. "Braver than you give yourself credit for. It takes courage to start over with nothing, or desperation. No, desperate people make desperate choices. You made a careful choice and followed through. That is courage." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused, his grip gentle despite the obvious strength in those fingers. "I am grateful you made it. Cannot imagine what this winter would have been like without you." She squeezed his hand, unable to find words adequate to express what his presence had meant to her, how much less lonely the world felt with him in it. Spring came late to the Colorado mountains, but when it finally arrived in early April, it transformed everything. Snow retreated to the highest peaks, and wildflowers exploded across meadows in riots of color. The trails they had walked in winter revealed entirely new personalities, creeks running high with snowmelt, trees budding green, wildlife emerging from hibernation. On a Sunday in late April, Dalton led her further than they had ever gone before, following a trail that climbed steadily for hours. Josephine had grown stronger over the winter months, her body adapting to both altitude and exertion, but this hike tested even her improved endurance. She pushed on without complaint, trusting that whatever lay ahead would be worth the effort. They emerged into an alpine meadow that looked like something from a dream. Wildflowers covered every inch, purple and yellow and white and pink, nodding in the breeze. A crystalline creek wound through the center, its water so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. Mountains ringed the meadow on all sides, and the sky overhead stretched impossibly blue. Dalton spread a blanket he had carried in his pack, an unpacked lunch, bread and cheese and dried meat, simple fare that tasted like a feast in such surroundings. They ate in comfortable silence, soaking in the beauty and the warmth of the spring sun. "This is my favorite place," Dalton said eventually. "I come here whenever I can, whenever I need to remember why I stay in these mountains. It is perfect, always has been, always will be." "It is incredible," Josephine agreed. "Thank you for bringing me here." "I have been thinking," he said, his voice careful, measured, "about us, about what we are doing, where this is going." Her heart stuttered, fear and hope warring in her chest. And he turned to face her fully, his pale blue eyes serious. "I love you, Josephine. I have loved you since that first day when you dropped your trunk and looked up at me with fire in your eyes, even though you were exhausted and afraid. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you laugh when I point out animal tracks. I love that you were brave enough to come west alone and brave enough to let me show you the mountains. I love everything about you." Tears blurred her vision. "Tobias, I know I am not much of a catch. I live in a cabin most folks would call primitive. I do not have wealth or status. I am better with mountains than people. But I would spend every day for the rest of my life showing you these trails, giving you every view, every secret place I know. I would keep you safe and warm and as happy as I know how to make you, if you will have me." "Yes," she said, the word breaking on a sob. "Yes, I love you too. I have loved you for months, maybe from the beginning. I have never felt this way, never been this happy, never felt this safe with anyone. Yes, I will have you for as long as you will have me." He kissed her then, gentle at first and then deeper, months of restrained longing finally unleashed. His hand cupped her face with such tenderness it made her ache, and she leaned into his strength, into the solid reality of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I will build you a better cabin," he promised. "Bigger, with real windows and a good stove. We can come to town when you want, stay in the mountains when you do not. Whatever you need, whatever makes you happy, I will find a way. I just need you," she said honestly. "Everything else we can figure out together." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Boulder's small church, with Mrs. Morrison and Fletcher standing as witnesses. Josephine wore a dress borrowed from Mrs. Morrison's daughter, and Dalton looked uncomfortable but handsome in clothes more formal than his usual buckskin and wool. His hand shook slightly when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he had traded furs to purchase, but his voice remained steady as he spoke his vows. She moved out of Mrs. Morrison's boarding house and into Dalton's cabin, a solid structure tucked into a valley 2 hours from town. It was indeed primitive by town standards, a single room with a sleeping loft, but it was clean and well built, and the view from the front door stole her breath. Dalton had already started work on an addition, determined to make good on his promise of something better. Fletcher understood when she resigned from the mining office, though he expressed genuine regret at losing her. "You did excellent work, Miss Thompson. Mrs. Dalton," he corrected with a smile. "If you ever need employment again, you need only ask." She thanked him, knowing she likely never would. Her life lay in the mountains now, with the man who had offered her every trail and called them all hers. That first year tested them both. Living in the wilderness full-time was harder than Josephine had anticipated, even with her Sunday excursions as preparation. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to preserve food for winter, to haul water from the creek and wash clothes by hand. She learned to recognize the sounds of danger, to respect the wilderness that could kill as easily as nurture. Dalton proved an endlessly patient teacher, showing her everything he knew about mountain living. Together they tended a garden, hunted and fished, gathered wild plants for food and medicine. He taught her to shoot, to track, to navigate by landmarks and stars. She taught him to read better, to enjoy the books she had brought with her, to appreciate the kind of ordered thinking that came naturally to her. Some days were hard, the isolation pressing in, the work exhausting. But more days were beautiful beyond measure, filled with a kind of peace and contentment she had never imagined possible. They worked side by side, talked for hours, made love under stars that blazed undimmed by any other light. That winter, their first together, Dalton finished the addition, doubling the cabin size and adding real glass windows that let in the light. They christened it on Christmas Eve with Mrs. Morrison and Fletcher as guests, a celebration of how far they had come and all they had built together. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Josephine discovered she was pregnant in March, the realization both thrilling and terrifying. Dalton's face when she told him cycled through shock, fear, and finally fierce joy. He became impossibly protective, trying to keep her from any task he deemed too strenuous, until she finally had to tell him firmly that pregnancy was not a disease, and she was perfectly capable of living her normal life. They compromised, as they had learned to do. She agreed to take fewer strenuous hikes and let him handle the heaviest work. He agreed to stop treating her like spun glass and trust that she would ask for help when needed. Their son was born on a snowy November evening with Mrs. Morrison in attendance as midwife. Dalton paced outside like a caged bear until the baby's first cry brought him rushing in, his face pale and frightened until he saw Josephine, exhausted but smiling, holding their tiny son. "Thomas," she said, naming him for Dalton's father. "Thomas Dalton, meet your papa." Dalton took his son with shaking hands, his expression full of wonder. "He is so small, he will grow, probably be as big as you eventually." She watched her husband cradle their baby with such gentleness, this hard mountain man transformed by love into something soft and vulnerable. "You are going to be a wonderful father." He looked at her with suspiciously bright eyes. "I will try. God knows I will try." Thomas proved a healthy, happy baby who adapted easily to cabin life. Josephine and Dalton figured out the challenges of parenting together, neither having much experience but both committed to doing their best. The cabin rang with new sounds, baby laughter and crying, lullabies and whispered conversations in the dark. When spring came again and Thomas was old enough to travel safely, Dalton strapped him to his chest in a sling and took them both back to the alpine meadow, where he had first declared his love. The wildflowers bloomed as brilliantly as ever, and Thomas grabbed at them with chubby baby hands, gurgling his delight. "Someday," Dalton said, "I will show him every trail just like I showed you. This will be his legacy, these mountains, this wild country. He will grow up knowing how to live here, how to respect and love it. And any other children we might have," Josephine added. He looked at her sharply, hope dawning. "Are you? Not yet. But someday maybe, if you want more." "I want everything with you," he said simply. "As many children as we are blessed with, as many years as we are given, all of it." She leaned against his solid strength, their son between them, surrounded by beauty that still took her breath away. "I never imagined this life, never dreamed I could be this happy. Neither did I. I thought I would spend my life alone up here, that it was enough. But then you arrived with your trunks and your determination, and everything changed." He kissed the top of her head. "Best day of my life when you dropped that trunk and looked up at me like you were ready to fight the world." "I was terrified. I know. But you did it anyway. That is what makes you brave." They stayed in the meadow for hours, letting Thomas nap in the warm sun while they talked and planned. More children eventually. Maybe a small horse barn, so Josephine could ride trails too steep or long to walk with little ones in tow. Perhaps a larger garden, trading excess vegetables in Boulder for supplies they could not make themselves. The years unfolded gently from there. Their daughter Alina arrived 2 years after Thomas, dark-haired like her mother and just as stubborn. Another son, James, came 2 years later, already trying to crawl before he could sit up properly, making Dalton laugh and predict he would be the adventurous one. The cabin expanded again, growing room by room to accommodate their growing family. It remained simple by town standards, but became a home filled with love and laughter, with children's toys scattered across the floor and laundry hanging to dry by the stove. Mrs. Morrison visited regularly, and Fletcher came once with his new wife, marveling at how well Josephine had adapted to mountain life. Dalton taught the children everything he knew, starting almost as soon as they could walk. Thomas proved a natural woodsman, serious and observant like his father. Alina loved the mountains but in her own way, more interested in the plants and flowers than tracking or hunting. James, true to predictions, was fearless and curious, constantly getting into trouble that required rescuing. Through it all, Josephine and Dalton maintained their tradition of walks together, escaping when they could for an hour or an afternoon, reclaiming the connection that had brought them together. He still showed her new trails, still pointed out views and named peaks, still offered her the mountains like a gift only he could give. "You know," she said one summer evening when the children were with Mrs. Morrison in town and they had the cabin to themselves, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" He pulled her closer on the porch where they sat watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and rose. "For seeing me that first day, for not just walking past, for carrying my trunks and showing me the mountains and falling in love with me, for giving me this life. Josephine." His voice held gentle rebuke. "You gave me just as much. More, maybe. I had the mountains, but I did not have a reason for them, not really. You gave me purpose. You and the children, this family we built. You took my lonely, beautiful life and made it something richer than I ever imagined." She tilted her face up for his kiss, still feeling that same thrill after all these years, that same sense of rightness. "I love you, Tobias Dalton. I love you, Josephine Dalton. Every day more than the day before." 20 years after that first meeting in Boulder, Josephine stood in the same alpine meadow where Dalton had first told her he loved her. She was 42 now, her hair showing streaks of gray, her hands marked by years of hard mountain living. But she was strong and healthy, happy in ways her younger self could never have predicted. Dalton stood beside her, silver threading liberally through his dark hair, his face more weathered but his eyes still that same piercing blue. Their children were grown or nearly so. Thomas at 19 had built his own cabin 2 valleys over, working as a guide and trapper like his father. Eleanor at 17 was courting a young man from Boulder, a carpenter's apprentice who had proven himself willing to adapt to mountain life. James at 15 was still figuring out his path, torn between the wilderness he loved and a curiosity about the wider world his parents had left behind. "Hard to believe it has been 20 years, Dalton said, echoing her thoughts as he so often did. "Best 20 years of my life. Mine too." He pulled her close and she leaned into his familiar strength, still finding comfort there after all this time. "You know what I remember most from that first day?" "What?" "How you looked when you first saw the mountains. That expression of absolute awe, like you were seeing something that changed everything. You still get that look sometimes, when the light hits just right or we round a corner to a new view." He turned her to face him, his hands warm on her shoulders. "Thank you for letting me show you all of this. For walking every trail with me, for making them ours instead of just mine. Thank you for offering them to me, for calling them mine when I had nothing, when I was just a scared woman from Ohio who had never seen mountains before." She smiled, blinking back happy tears. "You gave me the world, Tobias. We gave each other the world. That is how it works when it is right." They stayed in the meadow until sunset, watching the light change and shift, turning the mountains every shade of gold and rose and purple. Eventually, they would return to their cabin, to the life they had built, to whatever challenges and joys the future held. But for now, they simply stood together in the wilderness that had brought them together and watched beauty unfold. Josephine Thompson Dalton had never seen mountains before that dusty afternoon in Boulder, Colorado Territory, 1872. But a mountain man with gentle hands and a quiet voice had shown her every trail, had called them all hers, and in doing so had given her not just the mountains but a love that would last forever. And that, she thought as Dalton's arms tightened around her, and the sun sank behind distant peaks, was the greatest gift anyone had ever received. Their story could have ended there, with sunset in the meadow and contentment earned through years of love and labor. But life rarely gives neat endings, only new beginnings disguised as conclusions. They returned to the cabin as twilight painted everything blue and purple, hiking the familiar trail with easy confidence. Smoke rose from the chimney, James having returned before them to start dinner. He met them at the door, his young face unusually serious. "Mrs. Morrison sent word. She is feeling poorly and asked if Ma could come stay with her for a spell, help her with the boarding house until she recovers." He handed Josephine the note, written in Mrs. Morrison's shaky hand. Josephine read quickly, concern tightening her chest. Mrs. Morrison was nearly 75 now, still sharp as a tack but increasingly frail. She had been like a mother to Josephine, and the thought of her suffering alone in town felt intolerable. "I need to go," she said, looking to Dalton. Of course you do. We will pack tonight, head down first thing tomorrow. He squeezed her shoulder. She was there for you when you needed someone. Now you return the favor. They left at dawn, the whole family making the journey together. Mrs. Morrison's condition proved less dire than feared. A bad cold that had settled in her chest, but at her age any illness was serious. Josephine moved into the boarding house temporarily, nursing her old friend while Dalton and the boys stayed at the hotel, and Alina helped with the boarding house duties. Mrs. Morrison recovered slowly but steadily under Josephine's care. They spent long hours talking, reminiscing about that first year when Josephine had arrived alone and frightened, when Dalton had been a mysterious mountain man who frightened half the town, when the future had seemed so uncertain. "I knew," Mrs. Morrison said one afternoon, her voice still weak but determined. "I knew that first day when he carried your trunks upstairs. I saw how he looked at you, and I thought, well now, there is a man who has found something worth coming down from his mountain for. You never said anything. Did not need to. You two figured it out on your own the way the best matches do. No amount of meddling from old women was necessary." She patted Josephine's hand with fingers still strong despite her illness. "You have been happy, happier than I ever imagined I could be. Good, that is good. And those children of yours, they are fine young people. You and Dalton did well there. We did our best. Any parent who does their best and raises children who are kind, capable, and decent has succeeded. Everything else is just details." Mrs. Morrison closed her eyes, tired from the conversation. "You know, I am going to leave you the boarding house. Got it written in my will, filed with the lawyer. Figured you might want it, or if not, you could sell it and use the money however you need." Mrs. Morrison. "Hush now. I have no children of my own, and you were the daughter I always wished for. Let an old woman give gifts as she sees fit." Josephine did not argue further, just held the old woman's hand until she drifted into sleep. She sat there in the quiet room, thinking about the strange paths life took, how one advertisement in an Ohio newspaper had led her here, to this life, this family, this complicated, beautiful existence she could not have predicted. Mrs. Morrison recovered enough to resume light duties around the boarding house, though Josephine and Alina stayed another 2 weeks to make sure she was truly on the mend. During that time, Josephine also helped Fletcher at the mining office, his current bookkeeper having proven incompetent and left him drowning in disorganized records. "Just like old times," Fletcher joked, though his relief was obvious. "You always did have a gift for making chaos into order." "Numbers are easier than people," Josephine replied, efficiently sorting through the mess. "They follow rules." Working in the office again felt strange after so many years away, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit. She had not realized how completely she had adapted to mountain life until forced to resume the rhythms of town living. The office felt cramped and stuffy, despite the cool spring air outside. The constant noise of Boulder's growing population grated on nerves accustomed to wilderness quiet. But she was grateful to help Fletcher, and the work itself remained satisfying in its way. Numbers still made sense, ledgers still balanced or did not, problems still had solutions if you looked at them from the right angle. Dalton stopped by the office every afternoon, ostensibly to check on some detail or another, but really just to see her. They would steal a few minutes together, talking in low voices, his presence a reminder that this was temporary, that their real life waited in the mountains. "You could have this again if you wanted," he said one afternoon, genuine offer rather than test. "We could move closer to town, you could work here, I would adapt." "No, you would not. You would try for me, but you would be miserable, and I would be miserable knowing I had done that to you." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Our life is in the mountains. This is just a brief visit to help people we care about. Soon enough we will go home." Relief crossed his features, quickly hidden but visible to someone who knew him as well as she did. "You are sure? You do not miss this?" "I miss parts of it sometimes. The intellectual challenge, the sense of accomplishment from bringing order to chaos, but not enough to trade what we have. Not even close." They returned to their cabin at the end of April, leaving Alina in town to continue helping Mrs. Morrison. She had essentially taken over management of the boarding house, and both she and Mrs. Morrison seemed content with the arrangement. Her young man visited daily, courting properly under Mrs. Morrison's watchful eye. Summer passed in familiar rhythms. Dalton taught James advanced tracking and survival skills while Josephine tended their expanded garden and preserved food for winter. Thomas visited regularly, bringing his new wife, a quiet young woman from Denver who was learning to love the mountains. They were expecting their first child in the fall, making Dalton and Josephine grandparents. "Grandparents," Dalton said wonderingly one evening, the word strange in his mouth. "I am not old enough to be a grandfather. You are 47. That is more than old enough. Still. Seems like just yesterday we were the young ones starting out." Josephine laughed, feeling every one of her 42 years in her tired muscles. "We are not ancient, but we are not young either, and I am glad. I would not want to be 22 again, uncertain and afraid. I prefer being 42, certain and content." "Content, that is a good word." He pulled her close, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I am content too, more than content. I am grateful for every day of this life." Their first grandchild, a boy named Daniel, arrived in October. Josephine traveled to Thomas's cabin to help with the birth, staying 2 weeks to ensure both mother and baby were healthy. Holding her grandson for the first time, seeing Thomas's awed face as he cradled his son, brought tears she did not try to hide. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is terrifying," Thomas countered, but his smile was pure joy. "How did you and Pa make it look so easy?" "It was not easy. We just loved you enough to figure it out as we went, same as you will do." Winter brought news that Mrs. Morrison had passed peacefully in her sleep, Alina at her side. The funeral drew half of Boulder. Everyone with stories about the widow who had run the boarding house for 30 years and helped countless newcomers adjust to mountain life. Josephine grieved deeply for the woman who had been her first friend in Colorado, her surrogate mother, her companion through so many changes. But the grief was clean, unmarred by regret. They had said everything that needed saying, had spent good time together in those final years. True to her word, Mrs. Morrison had left the boarding house to Josephine. Alina wanted to continue running it, and her carpenter's apprentice, now a full carpenter, wanted to help. They married in the spring and took over the business, with Josephine's blessing and financial backing. "Another generation," Dalton observed, watching Alina and her new husband work on repairs to the boarding house. "It is strange, seeing our children build their own lives. It is what we raised them to do. I know, does not make it less strange." James, at 16, was proving the hardest to predict. He loved the mountains but chafed at their isolation. He wanted to see Denver, Santa Fe, maybe even San Francisco. He talked about trains and telegraphs and all the modern marvels transforming the world beyond their quiet valley. "I am not leaving forever," he insisted one evening when the topic came up again. "I just want to see what is out there. I will come back." "Your mother left Ohio and never went back," Dalton said quietly, not judging, just stating fact. "Sometimes when you leave, you find something that keeps you gone." "Is that what you are afraid of, that I will leave and never return?" "Yes," Dalton admitted, But that fear is mine to manage, not yours to solve. If you need to go, you should go. We will be here when you are ready to come back, if you are ready to come back. James left in the spring of 1894 at 17, heading to Denver with money saved from trapping and guiding. He promised to write, to visit, to stay in touch. They let him go because holding him would have been worse than losing him, but the cabin felt emptier with all 3 children grown and gone. "It is just us again," Josephine said, the words holding both melancholy and anticipation. "Like the beginning. Not quite like the beginning. We are older, grayer, more scarred." Dalton pulled her close. "But yes, just us. Is that enough? It is everything." They adapted to being alone again, rediscovering rhythms they had lost during the children years. They took longer hikes, stayed in the mountains for weeks at a time, reconnected with the wilderness that had brought them together. Dalton showed her trails she had never seen, places he had been saving, and called them all hers as he always had. James wrote regularly at first, then less frequently as he got caught up in city life. He found work with a surveying company, using the skills his father had taught him about reading landscape and weather. He sent photographs, new technology that still seemed like magic, showing himself in stiff formal clothes, looking older and more serious than seemed possible. Thomas and his wife had 2 more children, daughters who visited their grandparents regularly and learned the mountains from Dalton the same way their father had. Eleanor and her husband expanded the boarding house, adding rooms and modernizing the facilities while maintaining the welcoming atmosphere Mrs. Morrison had established. The years continued turning. Colorado became a state in 1876, bringing changes to Boulder and the surrounding area. The railroad came closer, bringing more settlers, more development. Parts of the wilderness Josephine and Dalton loved were logged or mined, familiar trails disrupted by new roads and claims, but their valley remained mostly untouched, too remote and difficult to attract serious commercial interest. They protected it fiercely, filing claims and using their knowledge of territorial law to keep others out. It would be their children's inheritance, they decided, and their children's children, preserved as long as possible against the encroachment of civilization. In 1900, Josephine turned 50 and Dalton 55. They celebrated quietly, just the 2 of them and Thomas's family, with a picnic in the alpine meadow that had witnessed so many important moments in their lives. The wildflowers bloomed as brilliantly as ever, and their grandchildren chased butterflies while Thomas and his wife set out the food. 50 years old, Josephine mused, watching the children play. When I was young, I thought 50 was ancient. And now? Now I know 50 is just another age like any other. I am tired more easily. My joints ache on cold mornings, but I am still me. Still capable, still strong enough to do what needs doing. You are stronger than most people half your age, Dalton said, pride evident in his voice. You walk trails that defeat men in their prime. You have earned every year. James came home that summer, the first time in 3 years. He looked like a stranger at first, dressed in city clothes, his hair cut short, his speech full of terms and references that meant nothing to his parents. But after a few days in the mountains, the old James emerged, shedding the city like ill-fitting skin. "I forgot," he said one evening, sitting on the cabin porch with his parents. "I forgot how quiet it is here, how the stars look, how clean the air smells. The city is exciting, but it is also loud and dirty and crowded. I understand now why you never wanted to leave." "Are you wanting to stay?" Dalton asked carefully. "No. My life is in Denver now, my work, my friends. But I needed to remember this, to remember where I came from. I will visit more often. That is a promise." He kept that promise, returning once or twice a year, sometimes with friends who wanted to experience the wilderness, sometimes alone. He never married, focusing instead on his career and his adventures. But he remained close to his family, writing regularly, sending money when they needed it even though they rarely did. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1903, Dalton took Josephine back to the exact spot where they had first met in Boulder. The town had grown almost unrecognizable, buildings where there had been empty lots, paved streets where there had been dirt paths. But the mountains remained, constant backdrop to all the change. 30 years, Dalton said, standing where he had stood that first day. If someone had told me that day that the exhausted woman with the trunk would become my wife, my partner, the love of my life, I would have laughed. I had convinced myself I would always be alone. And if someone had told me that the frightening mountain man would show me how to be brave, would give me the whole world, would love me better than I ever imagined being loved, I would have thought they were crazy. Josephine took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that had protected her for 3 decades. Thank you for stopping, for helping, for seeing me. Thank you for letting me, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for loving me despite everything I am not. I love you because of everything you are. There is no despite. They stood together in the busy street, 2 people in late middle age, weathered and scarred but still standing strong. Passers-by paid them no mind, too busy with their own concerns to notice the quiet reunion happening in their midst. But the mountains noticed, watching as they always had, constant witness to love and life and all the small moments that made up a human existence. The first decade of the new century brought more changes. Automobiles appeared in Boulder, noisy mechanical contraptions that terrified the horses. Thomas took over more of his father's guiding and trapping work as Dalton's knees began to protest the long mountain hikes. Josephine's hands developed arthritis, making some tasks difficult, but she adapted as she always had. They were grandparents 6 times over by 1910, with rumors of more on the way. Their cabin hosted regular gatherings of children and grandchildren, multiple generations learning the mountains and carrying on traditions Dalton and Josephine had established. In 1913, at age 63 and 58 respectively, they celebrated 40 years of marriage. Their children threw them a party in Boulder, renting space at Aliner's expanded boarding house, inviting what seemed like half the territory. Josephine wore a new dress Aliner had made, and Dalton submitted to a new suit, though he complained about the collar. 40 years, Thomas said in his toast, raising a glass to his parents. 40 years of showing all of us what love looks like, what commitment means, what it means to build a life together and never give up on it. Ma, Pa, thank you for the example, thank you for the love, thank you for everything. The gathering cheered and drank, and Josephine wiped away tears while Dalton shifted uncomfortably, never at ease with being the center of attention. But his smile was real, his joy obvious, his hand tight around hers. That night back in their cabin they lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of their mountain home. An owl called from nearby trees. The creek babbled in the distance. Wind sighed through the pines. 40 years, Josephine said into the darkness. It sounds like such a long time, but it feels like it passed in moments. The good things always do. The bad things drag, but the good things fly. Dalton rolled to face her, his hand finding her cheek. I would do it all again. Every moment, every choice, every hard winter and hot summer. I would choose you 1,000 times over. And I would choose you, always, forever. Until the mountains fall and the stars go dark, I would choose you. They made love gently, bodies familiar with age and experience, pleasure found in connection rather than urgency. Afterward, Wrapped in each other's arms, they drifted to sleep as they had for 40 years, safe and content. Dalton passed away in his sleep in the winter of 1915, at 65. He went peacefully, no struggle or pain, just there one moment and gone the next. Josephine woke to find him cold beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief nearly destroyed her. They had been together for 42 years, married for 40. He had shown her the mountains, had given her a life beyond anything she had dreamed possible. The thought of continuing without him seemed impossible, like being asked to breathe without air. Her children gathered around her, supportive and grieving themselves. They wanted her to move to town, to live with one of them, to leave the cabin that held so many memories. But she refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Your father and I built this life together. I'm not abandoning it just because he is gone. He is still here in every board and nail, in every trail and view. This is where I stay." Thomas moved his family closer, building a new cabin within walking distance, so someone would always be nearby. James came home from Denver and stayed for 2 months, helping with heavy work and making sure his mother would be all right. Eleanor visited weekly, bringing supplies and company. Josephine grieved, but she survived. She walked the trails Dalton had shown her, visiting all the places they had loved. She spoke to him in the silence, trusting that somehow he could hear. She found comfort in the mountains that had brought them together, in the enduring beauty that death could not diminish. Spring came, as it always did, transforming the landscape with color and life. Josephine made the pilgrimage to their alpine meadow, the place where Dalton had first told her he loved her, where they had celebrated anniversaries and shared countless peaceful hours. The wildflowers bloomed as brilliantly as ever, purple and yellow and white and pink, nodding in the breeze. She spread a blanket and sat, letting the sun warm her bones, letting the beauty soak into the wounded places. "I miss you," she said to the empty air. "Every moment of every day I miss you, but I am grateful too, grateful for every year we had, every moment we shared. You gave me the world, Tobias. You showed me every trail and called them all mine. Now I have to figure out how to walk them without you." A breeze stirred the flowers, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. A hawk circled overhead, crying out. The mountains stood eternal, watching as they always had. Josephine lived another 10 years, dying peacefully at age 70 in 1925. She remained in the cabin until the end, tending her garden, walking shorter trails, welcoming children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came to learn the mountains from the woman who had mastered them, despite starting life in flat Ohio with no knowledge of wilderness. Thomas found her on a summer morning, sitting on the porch with a blanket over her lap, her face turned toward the mountains she had loved for over 50 years. She held a photograph of Dalton, taken years before, and her expression was peaceful, almost joyful, as though she had seen something wonderful in those final moments. They buried her next to Dalton in a small cemetery near Boulder, their graves marked with simple stones. But their real monument was the cabin they had built, the children and grandchildren they had raised, the trails they had walked and loved. Their legacy lived in every person who knew these mountains, who respected their beauty and their danger, who understood that the greatest gift anyone could offer was the wilderness itself, shared freely with an open heart. James, now 51 and retired from surveying, moved into the cabin permanently, taking over its care and continuing his parents' tradition of protecting the valley. He guided occasionally, showing others the trails his father had shown his mother, telling stories about two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. On the 50th anniversary of Dalton and Josephine's wedding, The whole family gathered in the alpine meadow. 3 generations came, from Thomas's great-grandchildren to James's adopted daughter, all connected by the love story that had started with a dropped trunk and a helpful stranger. They spread blankets and shared a meal, told stories and laughed and cried. Someone had brought the photograph of Dalton and Josephine on their 40th anniversary, and it was passed around, each person studying the weathered faces, the obvious love, the contentment earned through decades of choosing each other. "Tell us again," one of the youngest great-grandchildren asked James. "Tell us how they met." James smiled, settling into the story he had told 100 times and would tell 100 more. "Your great-great-grandmother arrived in Boulder in 1872, alone and scared, with everything she owned in 2 trunks. She had never seen mountains before, but a mountain man stopped to help her, and he showed her every trail. He called them all hers, and she loved him for it until the day she died." The child considered this, young face serious. And he loved her too, more than anything in the world, more than the mountains he had loved his whole life. He loved her best of all. The gathering sat in the meadow as the sun moved across the sky, casting changing shadows across the peaks. The wildflowers bloomed as they always had, as they always would, eternal and beautiful and free. And somewhere, in the wind that stirred the flowers and the mountains that watched over them all, 2 souls walked together still, following trails that would never end, love that would never fade, a story that would be told and retold until the last mountain fell. She had never seen mountains before, but a mountain man showed her every trail and called them all hers, and in giving her the mountains, he gave her everything. The greatest love story was not the one that burned brightest, but the one that burned longest, steady and true through all the years, all the changes, all the challenges. Josephine and Dalton's love had been exactly that, a quiet, constant fire that warmed everyone it touched and left the world brighter for its existence. Their story was over, but its echoes continued, rippling forward through generations, teaching the value of courage and love and choosing each other every single day. In the end, that was all anyone could hope for: to love well, to be loved in return, and to leave behind something beautiful that would outlast the brief candle of a human life. The mountains remained, eternal witness, holding their secrets and their stories. And among all those stories, none shone brighter than the tale of a woman from Ohio and the mountain man who showed her how to be brave, how to love, how to see the world as it truly was, beautiful and harsh and endlessly worth fighting for.